Some films pretend to be chaotic. The Nest didn't have to pretend. It twisted, shifted, and warped itself into existence. The deeper the crew pushed, the stranger the production behaved, as if the film were mutating scene by scene. Miniatures collapsed along impossible lines. Cameras drifted as though avoiding something, and ambient recordings captured patterns no one could identify. Why did every technical failure echo the logic of infestation? And why did the set feel less like a location and more like a living environment responding to their presence? These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about. The Nest 1988. Fact 1. One of the earliest disruptions during the making of The Nest came from the production's uncompromising decision to work with real cockroaches. It wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it was an obsession, a belief that the creature's twitching unpredictability would convey a sense of contamination no prop could imitate. The roaches arrived in temperature-controlled crates, the kind used for transporting delicate biological specimens, and their constant rustling created a background noise that unsettled even seasoned crew members. Many reported feeling as though the insects were responding to the energy around them, clustering near certain corners of the set as if drawn to unseen stimuli. Handling them became a ritual of precision. Wranglers used soft brushes, red-filtered lights, and temperature cues to control the insect's movement. Yet, despite these tools, the roaches maintained a defiant independence. Some vanished into cracks in the set walls, emerging hours later in unrelated scenes. Others crawled into equipment cases, appearing unexpectedly during lighting checks. One particularly bold insect positioned itself along a camera track during a test run and moved perfectly in sync with the dolly, creating a moment so bizarre that several crew members insisted it looked rehearsed. The psychological toll grew with each passing day. Crew members began wearing their socks over their pants to prevent the sensation of tiny legs brushing against their ankles. Actors rehearsed lines while keeping nervous watch on the floor. And although the Wranglers insisted every missing roach would eventually reappear, the idea of an unseen swarm lurking nearby became an unspoken dread that permeated the production. When footage was reviewed, something else emerged. In several shots, clusters of roaches moved in strangely unified arcs, forming curves that appeared almost geometric. Whether coincidence, instinct, or illusion brought on by exhaustion, no one agreed. But the impressions remained vivid enough that the director chose to keep those takes untouched. By the end of filming, the roaches weren't just background props. They had become an unpredictable force, shaping the mood, the tension, and even the performances. Their presence felt less like an addition to the film and more like a silent collaborator, imposing its own logic on the production. Fact 2. Among the most grueling challenges of The Nest were the human transformation scenes, grotesque displays of mutation intended to mirror the roaches' accelerated evolution. Creating these effects required the actors to endure layers of prosthetics so thick they transformed simple movement into a test of endurance. The makeup team applied foam latex appliances, resin caps, and viscous gels designed to simulate ruptured skin and organic growth. Once the pieces were adhered, the actors' range of motion narrowed drastically, trapping heat and sweat beneath the layers until breathing felt laborious. The pressure of the prosthetics pressed into their cheekbones, jawlines, and necks, creating a dull ache that intensified during long shooting days. Between takes, the crew used handheld fans and ice packs to keep the actors from overheating, but the relief was temporary. On more than one occasion, the adhesives began to break down mid-scene, causing sections of the prosthetic to swell or sag in ways no one had planned. The director embraced these unpredictable distortions, arguing that genuine discomfort produced more authentic performances. Removing the prosthetics was its own ordeal. The adhesives bonded with hair and delicate skin, requiring slow, painstaking dissolution to avoid tearing. Some actors whispered through clenched teeth during removal, desperate to keep steady as the makeup team worked millimeter by millimeter. Despite their best efforts, several performers left the production with temporary abrasions, redness, and in one case, a lingering sensitivity to certain adhesives. What unsettled the effects team most was how the materials behaved under tungsten lighting. The heat caused the gel components to ripple subtly, almost as if the prosthetics were breathing independently of the actors. In one take, a cheek appliance twitched without any muscular input, a reaction no one could replicate during testing. The shot was kept, its accidental realism far surpassing the intended effect. By the end of production, the transformation sequences felt less like special effects and more like controlled metamorphosis. The actors didn't just portray characters breaking down under unnatural forces, they lived a physical echo of the film's central theme, the body reshaped by something it cannot fight. Fact 3. The soundscape of The Nest remains one of its most haunting achievements, due in part to the unconventional techniques used to craft the roach's presence. Instead of relying on simple insect recordings, the sound team built a library of unsettling textures from non-insect sources. They crinkled thin sheets of metal to mimic the hard twitch of exoskeletons, dragged combs across taut wires for clicking patterns, and layered dampened percussion to create the illusion of thousands of tiny impacts. But the most haunting element came from analog recordings sourced from a biological research facility, featuring slow, rhythmic pulses whose origins were intentionally vague. When these layers were combined, the result was a sound unlike anything natural, a hybrid of organic and mechanical tones that felt disturbingly sentient. During mixing sessions, engineers noted that certain combinations of frequencies caused the roach sounds to respond to dialogue or movement in the footage, rising or falling in uncanny synchronicity. Whether this effect was psychological or accidental harmonic resonance remained debated among the crew. During one late-night editing session, an engineer isolated a high-frequency layer to refine its timing. Slowed down, the sample revealed a series of clicks arranged in curiously even spacing. The pattern resembled a form of primitive rhythm, not melodic, not random, but structured, as if reflecting a hidden cadence. He replayed it multiple times, each repetition amplifying the unsettling sense that the sound carried intention rather than chaos. Attempts to remove the layer from the mix only made the remaining audio feel hollow and incomplete, as if the film's atmosphere required that peculiar rhythm to remain intact. Ultimately, the team buried the most disturbing elements deep beneath other effects, audible only to those who listen closely or who sense the subtle agitation they create without fully understanding why. Even today, viewers often describe discomfort during scenes involving heavy swarm audio, despite no obvious jump scares. It's not the volume or aggression of the sound, but its rhythm, a whispering suggestion of communication or perhaps coordination lurking beneath the surface. A sound less heard than felt, hinting that the swarm never acts alone. Fact 4. The creation of the partially devoured bodies in the nest involved a materials experiment that veered into unsettling territory almost immediately. The effects team aimed for realism beyond the usual latex and paint formula, so they developed a hybrid mixture of gelatinous compounds, semi-organic gels, and a translucent membrane designed to mimic flesh softened by chemical decay. Under controlled conditions, the mixture behaved perfectly, but once placed beneath studio lights, the materials reacted in ways no one had predicted. The bodies sagged in strange, uneven patterns, their surfaces glistening as though secreting moisture. Crew members who had worked with cadaver models in medical training remarked uneasily that the resemblance was disturbingly close. Handling the props became a dreaded task. The gel clung stubbornly to gloves, leaving behind thin, elastic strands that snapped slowly when stretched. More troubling was the way the props settled during takes. Limbs shifted subtly, torsos slumped, and fragments sank in slow-motion collapse. One camera operator reported seeing a chest cavity breathe as heat caused the membrane to expand rhythmically, though playback revealed only a faint tremble. During storage, the bodies continued to deteriorate. Some developed fissures that resembled organic ruptures, splitting along branching lines that looked deliberate rather than random. Other props wept small droplets of gel overnight, pooling in patterns that technicians struggled to explain. They checked for contamination, humidity issues, even possible fungal growth, yet none provided an answer. The gel formula appeared stable on paper, but its behavior suggested a creeping instability tied to environmental exposure. One particularly unsettling moment came when a prop, untouched for hours, collapsed inward, as if folding around a hollow center. The collapse was gentle yet inexplicably structured, as though following an invisible blueprint. The effects team attempted to replicate the event with new batches of the mixture, but nothing behaved similarly. By the time production wrapped, the bodies could no longer be preserved. They hardened into opaque lumps, losing the unnerving qualities that had made them so convincing. Still, those who worked with them recall the same impression, that the props didn't simply deteriorate, they performed their own quiet imitation of decay, as if mimicking a biological process no one intended to recreate. Fact 5. The abandoned coastal structure, where many of the nest's key scenes were filmed, carried an atmosphere so oppressive that even seasoned crew members found themselves reluctant to work there after dark. The building, riddled with narrow gaps and half-rotted beams, made the perfect visual counterpart to the film's narrative of contamination. But soon after the production began staging scenes involving bait mixtures and roach containers, subtle disturbances started to manifest. At first it was faint, scratching under the floor, then soft, rhythmic tapping along the walls, and eventually, a sound akin to sand shifting in thin, continuous streams. When technicians investigated the crawl space, they reported clusters of insects far larger than expected for an abandoned structure. Some of these species weren't native to the area. Their presence raised questions. But before any entomologist could be brought in, the crew sealed the openings and continued filming. The disturbances didn't stop. Props left overnight appeared repositioned, dust patterns subtly altered, and trails that looked like tiny, winding pathways materialized across unused corners of the set. Safety personnel dismissed these as drafts or structural shifts, but when one of the grip team discovered a spiral-shaped pattern etched into dust in the hallway, a shape strongly resembling the roach swarming pattern staged elsewhere in the film, the mood shifted from nervous pragmatism to quiet dread. Attempts were made to capture the disturbances on camera, but each time equipment was left unattended, the batteries drained inexplicably or the footage came back blank. Eventually, an exterminator was brought in discreetly. His assessment was inconclusive. He couldn't determine what species had moved through the structure or why the patterns appeared so intentional. The disturbances ceased only after the roach crates were moved off-site for several days, suggesting some correlation no one wanted to articulate. Years later, when the building was demolished, workers reported finding strange, tunnel-like grooves beneath the foundation, too shallow for animals, too irregular for water erosion. Whether the result of insects, vibration, or imagination, the building left behind an impression that it had not merely hosted the production, it had responded to it. Fact 6. One of the most mysterious elements of the Nest's early production was an entire subplot that vanished before the final cut, leaving behind fragments that still trouble those who remember it. The discarded storyline centered on a researcher documenting behavioral anomalies among colony-based species. His scenes were filmed in a dim, cluttered lab filled with makeshift experiments. Jars of preserved specimens, stacks of handwritten journals, and chalk diagrams illustrating accelerated evolutionary models. The actor's performance was unsettlingly calm, his monologues delivered like academic confessions spoken to an invisible audience. Yet something strange occurred whenever these scenes were recorded. The audio captured during his monologues frequently contained faint, patterned clicks that neither the equipment nor the environment could explain. Engineers replaced microphones, examined wiring, and even changed the recording location, but the interference persisted only during these sequences. The patterns bore loose resemblance to the film's swarm audio, but this subplot had been shot before any of the creature sound design existed. Even more disconcerting were inconsistencies in the footage. In several takes, the actor appeared to hesitate just before delivering lines that didn't appear on the script pages saved in the production binder. When questioned, he insisted he had followed the script exactly. Editors checking continuity noticed that certain journal pages seemed to appear in different arrangements from shot to shot, despite no one handling them between takes. When the decision was made to cut the subplot, the set was dismantled, but during cleanup, crew members found chalk markings on the blackboard arranged in spiraling lines, markings no one recalled drawing. Journals left open revealed crude sketches of segmented shapes and branching pathways. None of the sketches matched the artwork commissioned for the film. While the subplot never appeared in the final movie, fragments of its audio bled subtly into later scenes, faintly audible under layers of swarm effects. Whether accidental or intentional, these remnants suggest that the narrative, once removed, left echoes behind traces of a story that seemed unwilling to disappear completely. Fact 7. The lighting techniques used on the Nest became infamous among the crew, not because they were groundbreaking, but because of the strange, almost biological behavior of the custom gels created for the film. The cinematographer, determined to evoke a sense of environmental contamination, experimented with hand-mixed coatings applied directly to the light housings. The blends distorted color temperature in unpredictable ways, bathing scenes in an eerie, uneven glow that made walls appear slick and surfaces pulse with dampness. At first, these experiments seemed merely unconventional. Then the anomalies began. Some gels warped under heat, bending into shallow bowls that refracted light oddly, creating shifting, amoeba-like patches that crawled across the set. Others emitted a faint haze under high wattage, leaving drifting trails visible only in the corner of the frame. Crew members working night shifts reported feeling strangely disoriented under the altered beams, as if the shadows were watching them rather than merely reflecting their shapes. One evening, during preparations for a major transformation scene, a coated bulb fractured silently. No explosion, no crack, only a soft collapse. A fine dust descended in spiraling patterns, dissolving before it touched the floor. The crew attempted to replicate the event, but new coatings behaved normally. Yet photographs from that night displayed faint, curving shapes in the air, almost like tendrils illuminated by the flash. Efforts to recreate the precise lighting tone later for pickup shots failed uniformly. Even when the cinematographer followed the same recipe, the gels stayed stable, predictable, ordinary. He insisted the original mixtures had been improvised on set, guided by instinct rather than measurement. But those who worked beneath their glow recall the same sense, that the lighting didn't just illuminate the space, it altered it, as though responding to something in the environment. The final film contains brief, unsettling moments where the light seems to waver without cause. Viewers often assume these effects were deliberate. The truth is more ambiguous. The lights on the nest behaved as though influenced by more than electricity and chemistry, flickering with a strange, uninvited life. Fact 8. During the editing of The Nest, the post-production team uncovered anomalies so persistent that they initially assumed the original negatives had been corrupted. The disturbances occurred primarily in scenes related to the swarm, faint, stuttering flickers along the lower frame, as though something were darting just beyond visual clarity. At normal speed, the distortions looked like static. Slowed down, however, they resembled segmented shapes, appearing for only a handful of frames before vanishing again. Editors suspected mechanical issues and examined the scanners used to digitize the footage. They cleaned rollers, replaced lamps, and tested multiple machines. Yet the anomalies remained confined exclusively to swarm-related scenes. Footage from dialogue sequences, wide shots, and insert plates appeared perfectly clean. What disturbed the team further was the strange synchrony between the flickers and the film's sound design. When certain layers of the swarm audio were played alongside the footage, particularly the low-frequency pulses, the visual distortions increased in intensity, briefly aligning with the rhythm as though reacting to it. Attempts to separate the elements only amplified the effect. Frequency analysis produced waveforms that looked strangely similar to the shapes seen in the flickering frames. One night, an editor reversed a particularly distorted sequence out of curiosity. As the frames played backward, the flickers converged instead of dispersing, forming rippling lines that moved toward the center of the screen. The room fell silent. No one could agree whether the effect was meaningful or coincidental, but all agreed it felt wrong, like motion belonging to something that wasn't supposed to be filmed. Curiously, when the film was transferred years later for television syndication, the anomalies disappeared completely. The same reels, scanned with modern equipment, produced no flicker at all. Some chalked it up to improved stabilization. Others insisted the distortions had been real, tied not to the film stock, but to the environment in which the footage had been captured. In the theatrical cut, the faint disturbances remain. Whether viewers interpret them as artistic choices or unnoticed glitches, they are echoes of a technical mystery the crew never fully solved, fragments of a presence on the edge of visibility. Fact 9. Before the final creature suit was completed, the effects team relied on a skeletal prototype to rehearse the queen monster's movements. Built from PVC tubing, ball joints, and strips of fabric, the framework looked primitive, nothing more than a placeholder meant to approximate mass and posture. Yet from the moment rehearsals began, the prototype developed a troubling reputation. Performers described it as shifting unexpectedly, pivoting on its joints even when untouched. At first, the team suspected uneven flooring or loose fasteners, but tightening the joints only made the movements sharper and more abrupt. During one rehearsal, the prototype lurched forward with enough force to knock an actor off balance. The performer insisted he hadn't touched it. Others in the room shared the same impression. The structure had moved of its own accord. Though the team dismissed the incident as mechanical instability, the unease lingered. The full queen suit, when finally constructed, was far heavier and unwieldy, requiring several handlers to keep it stable. Yet scenes involving the creature often carried remnants of the prototype's unsettling rhythm. Actors flinched at unexpected moments, reacting to shifts the bulky suit wasn't physically capable of producing. Even handlers reported feeling sudden redistributions of weight inside the suit, brief but noticeable, as though the framework were adjusting independently. When production wrapped, the prototype was dismantled, but technicians noticed odd patterns on the floor beneath where it had stood, arcs traced in dust, faint but consistent, like the tracks of an object repeatedly rotating in a tight radius. Fabric strips from the joints were stretched in irregular patterns, as though subjected to repeated tension. The prototype was never used again, and no one claimed responsibility for maintenance errors. Still, those who rehearsed with it recall the same uneasy thought that the skeletal frame, though built as a placeholder, behaved for a brief time like an early, unstable version of the creature it would become. Fact 10. The miniature models created for the nest were intended as simple tools, small-scale replicas built to depict destruction in shots that would be too expensive to film full-size. But the models themselves quickly became one of the production's strangest problems. The effects crew crafted detailed facsimiles of the island's streets, docks, and coastline using foam, balsa wood, resin, and heat-reactive compounds meant to simulate organic decay. Under test lights, the models behaved predictably, curling and warping in ways that mimicked infestation spreading through structures. But once filming began, their reactions drifted into unsettling territory. Several miniatures warped long before the lamps were turned on, as if reacting to the mere presence of the equipment. Roofs buckled overnight, walls slumped in slow spirals, and certain structures collapsed inward along unnervingly symmetrical paths. Even when technicians confirmed that no heaters, fans, or drafts had interfered, the distortions continued. The most troubling occurred when a replica of the island's main street developed branching cracks along the asphalt cracks that resembled tunnels more than surface fractures. Temperature logs showed irregular fluctuations around some models, small but consistent. Foam samples tested after the warping revealed no chemical instability, yet their behavior suggested an internal shift that the crew couldn't replicate under controlled conditions. Attempts to rebuild the warped miniatures for continuity failed. Replacement models remained stable and inert, lacking the strange responsiveness seen in the originals. During the final miniature destruction sequence, cameras captured the spontaneous collapse of a building corner that no one had touched. The footage was kept, its realism too striking to discard. But afterward, when the crew dismantled the set, they found the warped pieces almost fused together, as though the material had melted and re-hardened in its distorted shape. By the end of production, most of the original models had deteriorated beyond use. Attempts to reconstruct the heat-reactive mixture years later produced results too clean, too controlled, missing the disturbing, almost organic unpredictability of the originals. For many on the effects team, the miniatures didn't just represent the island's decay, they performed it, following a logic the crew never fully decoded. Fact 11. The internal anatomy of the mutated queen creature in the nest was one of the film's most ambitious practical builds, but what happened once the internal structure was activated remains one of its strangest legacies. The construction involved layers of translucent tubing, gel-filled sacs, flexible bladders, and air channels designed to contract rhythmically under hidden pumps. When illuminated from behind, the setup created a disturbingly lifelike pulsation, as though the creature were breathing through an alien circulatory system. The rig performed flawlessly during initial tests, but once installed inside the queen suit, its behavior began shifting in ways that baffled the effects team. Sacs inflated slowly without any operator input. Gel tubes quivered even when pumps were inactive. At one point, a section of tubing began a subtle peristaltic motion, tightening and releasing in a rhythmic pattern that technicians insisted they had not programmed. Some attributed it to heat buildup, others suspected leftover pressure. Yet the movements persisted only during certain scenes and vanished the moment the rig was removed from the set. The most alarming incident occurred during a climactic fight scene. Mid-take, several internal chambers swelled violently, pressing against the suit's shell and distorting the creature's silhouette into a grotesque, asymmetrical mutation. Though the performer inside felt the suit tightening around him, he continued the scene until the director called cut. Once the suit was opened, technicians found several sections of tubing fused together. Their interiors thickened into irregular lumps resembling embryonic clusters. After the production wrapped, attempts to replicate the internal rig for promotional demonstrations failed. The new versions behaved normally: no spontaneous movement, no swelling, no unexpected contractions. The original internal structure, however, had hardened into a tangled mass, its chambers sealed, its gel darkened into a wax-like substance that resisted analysis. To the crew, the Queen's anatomy seemed less like a designed mechanism and more like a brief experiment in artificial biology, something that reacted to the heat, pressure, and atmosphere of the set in ways no one intended or understood. Fact 12. The costumes designed for the nest had one crucial requirement. They needed to survive constant exposure to slime, adhesives, humidity, and physical handling from both actors and insect wranglers. Traditional fabrics broke down too quickly under these conditions, so the wardrobe department devised a custom synthetic blend coated with a polymer finish that repelled moisture and resisted tearing. At first, the material seemed ideal, durable, flexible, and easy to clean between takes. But once filming began, the costumes started exhibiting behaviors the wardrobe team struggled to explain. Under strong lighting, the polymer coating shimmered with a faint, shifting iridescence that moved across the fabric like a thin film of oil drifting over water. This was not part of the design. Crew members remarked that the effect made the actors appear as though they were reflecting a non-human spectrum of light, giving their movements an uncanny, insect-like quality even in simple dialogue scenes. The polymer reacted even more unpredictably during sequences involving fog machines. Thick mist caused the coating to form temporary patterns, segmented shapes, branching lines, and tiny pits resembling the texture of an insect's exoskeleton. These markings faded after the fabric dried, and repeated tests in controlled environments failed to produce the same effect. The patterns appeared only during active shooting, never during rehearsals. A stranger complication emerged when the roach wranglers released controlled insects onto the costumes. The creatures showed a marked preference for the polymer-coated garments, clustering on them longer than expected and often returning after being brushed away. Technicians checked the coating for scent traces or chemicals that might attract insects, but found nothing unusual. Yet the behavior persisted until the wardrobe department altered the formula slightly. Months after filming ended, archivists retrieving the costumes from storage discovered subtle cracking in the polymer layer. The cracks formed delicate lattice-like formations, almost as if the coating had attempted to mimic the segmented geometry it had displayed under fog. None of the other fabrics stored nearby exhibited similar aging. Whether a quirk of chemistry or something drawn out by the film's unusual conditions, the costumes briefly behaved like skins, responding to an environment shifting, shimmering, and marking themselves as though echoing the creatures they shared the screen with. Fact 13. Among the more unusual experiments attempted during the nest was a custom-built camera rig designed to imitate movement patterns closer to instinct than intention. The cinematographer wanted certain shots to feel as though the viewer were seeing through an unfamiliar consciousness, jittery, low to the ground, and subtly reactive to vibration. To achieve this, a modified rig was constructed with an internal oscillating weight meant to destabilize the lens just enough to produce an organic wobble. Early trials created a peculiar, rhythmic drift, almost like the camera were breathing. However, once rehearsals began, the device took on a life of its own. The oscillation grew erratic, sometimes freezing, sometimes lunging sharply, as if struck by an unseen jolt. During one unsettling test, the rig veered abruptly to the left, sweeping across a table of rubber roaches and knocking several to the floor. The operator swore he hadn't applied pressure. Tightening the joints didn't help. The rig responded with new, sharper spasms, as though resisting the stabilizations imposed on it. Footage captured during these sessions proved even stranger. When slowed for review, the images contained distortions that didn't align with the rig's movement. Thin streaks flashed across the frame, resembling motion trails from something moving faster than the camera could resolve. Editors initially dismissed them as light leaks, but the streaks appeared consistently in scenes filmed closest to the floor or near textured surfaces, the kinds of environments where real insects might navigate. Attempts to diagnose the rig found no mechanical faults. The oscillating weight was balanced, the bearings clean, the circuitry intact. Yet the irregular behavior persisted, seemingly triggered only during scenes thematically tied to the swarm. Once the decision was made to abandon the experiment entirely, the rig was stored away. Months later, when retrieved for inspection, the internal weight had locked into an unnatural angle, refusing to reset despite force or lubrication. Those who reviewed the surviving test footage still describe a strange impression that the camera wasn't malfunctioning, but responding, however faintly, to a movement rhythm that didn't originate from the crew. Fact 14. Years after The Nest completed production, archivists attempting to catalog the film's practical assets stumbled across a collection of plaster molds used to cast roach husks and half-transformed bodies. At first glance, they appeared typical worn, dusty, lined with residue from foam latex pores, but closer inspection revealed intricate patterns etched deep into their interiors. The grooves formed pathways that branched, curved, and intersected with uncanny symmetry, mimicking the tunnel systems of eusocial insects. No one from the original team recalled making such designs. The molds, according to archive notes, were plain when first constructed. Some believed the etchings were the product of erosion, but the grooves were too sharp, too deliberate, and too consistent across multiple molds. Chemical analysis found faint organic discoloration in some grooves, but no source could be determined. The possibility of insects carving the patterns was dismissed. Plaster was far too dense, and the shapes were far too structured. Digital overlays revealed something more unsettling. When the patterns from multiple molds were combined, they formed a continuous network, as though pieces of a larger map had been distributed across separate props. Even more disturbing was their resemblance to diagrams found in abandoned storyboards for a subplot that never made it into the film, a sequence exploring communal intelligence developing within the mutated roach population. Some archivists speculated that an unknown crew member had carved the patterns as a private artistic flourish. Others suspected unnoticed chemical reactions caused by the gel mixtures used during casting. But neither theory explained why the grooves mirrored motifs appearing later in unrelated aspects of the production's sound interference, prop movement, and set disturbances. When the molds were placed into climate-controlled storage, further etching appeared over the following months, as though the patterns were still evolving. To halt deterioration, the studio eventually sealed them in archival resin, freezing the mysterious network in place. To this day, the molds remain a quiet enigma, objects intended to shape fictional creatures, yet bearing markings that seem to grow in patterns of their own. Fact 15. The ambient recordings gathered for The Nest were meant to provide subtle background textures: wind passing through abandoned structures, wooden beams shifting under pressure, the quiet hum of distant shorelines. But what the sound team captured inside a crumbling coastal building quickly became one of the film's most unsettling artifacts. The microphones picked up faint, intermittent tapping too fast for dripping water, too deliberate for random structural noise. Each cluster of taps followed a recognizable rhythm, separated by a low, wavering tone that vibrated just below audible range. At first, the crew assumed an animal was moving through the walls, but the tapping occurred in multiple areas simultaneously, captured on microphones spaced far apart. The team repositioned their equipment, sealed drafts, and eliminated vibrating fixtures. Still, the patterns persisted, emerging only between midnight and 3 a.m., tapering off the moment dawn approached. Back in the studio, spectral analysis revealed that the underlying hum shifted in response to the tapping, as though the two elements were communicating. Engineers tried isolating the frequencies, but removing one layer caused the others to distort into new patterns. An attempt to slow the recording revealed clusters of taps spaced with mathematical precision, though not in any recognizable code. One technician, after hours of listening, remarked that the rhythm reminded him of swarm movement, not literal footsteps, but coordinated pulses echoing through confined spaces. Others dismissed the idea as fatigue-induced imagination, but no one offered a more plausible explanation. The director chose not to use the raw tapping in the final mix, fearing it would distract from the orchestrated soundscape, but fragments of the recordings were blended into the background of several swarm sequences, buried just low enough to create subconscious tension. When the crew returned months later to the same structure to capture retakes, the building was silent. Whatever had produced the tapping had vanished without trace. The structure was demolished shortly afterward, leaving only the recordings unnerving, indecipherable, and forever tied to a moment when the sound team captured something moving in darkness just beyond human perception. Fact 16. Among the many unexplained technical issues during the making of The Nest, the most persistent involved the camera's inability to maintain stable focus whenever roach elements, real or artificial, were introduced into a scene. Operators noticed the issue during early tests. The lens would soften subtly, then drift further until the shot resembled a slow exhale. When the roaches were removed, the equipment behaved flawlessly. This pattern repeated so consistently that some crew members began marking the floor with tape to track where the distortions occurred, hoping it was an environmental quirk. Technicians recalibrated the cameras repeatedly, recentered the glass, stabilized the housings, and controlled for temperature variations. Yet the malfunctions appeared only during scenes involving swarm movement, particularly shots close to the floor. Footage review revealed something even stranger: micro shifts in exposure occurring at the same time the focus drifted. These weren't lighting fluctuations, they were momentary dips in the ambient luminance of the room, barely perceptible but consistent. When editors examined individual frames, they discovered faint ripples along the edges of the softened image, like pressure waves moving through air. One editor compared the effect to heat distortion, except it appeared in cold rooms with no active lamps. Another joked that the camera was reacting to the swarm the way an organism recoils from stimulus. The laughter dissipated when the anomalies escalated. During a key take, the camera drifted entirely out of focus, then snapped back in a single jolt, a motion impossible for the model being used. The operator insisted he hadn't touched the focus wheel. When playback was analyzed, the jolt aligned with a moment when several roaches scattered simultaneously, as if the movement had triggered the equipment. The cameras were replaced mid-production. The new units worked perfectly for the rest of the shoot. When the original cameras were tested later, every component passed inspection. No faults, no irregular wear, no signs of mechanical stress. The crew ultimately archived the anomalies as unrepeatable environmental artifacts, but those who witnessed them firsthand often described the same unsettling impression that the camera wasn't failing, it was responding, however subtly, to something it could detect before humans could. Fact 17. The laboratory set, built for The Nest, became the center of one of the film's most persistent mysteries: the phenomenon of props rearranging themselves overnight. The layout was carefully documented each evening through detailed continuity photos. Yet nearly every morning, the decorator returned to find objects resting in new positions. Sometimes the shifts were small, a scalpel angled differently, a notebook slightly ajar. Other days, the changes were impossible to dismiss. Vials forming spirals, papers clustered near the same corner of the table, no matter where they had been placed the day before. At first, the crew suspected late-night staff were inadvertently disturbing the set, but when the production locked the building after wrap and installed additional security checkpoints, the movements continued. The logs showed no unauthorized access. No signs of intrusion. Yet each morning, the changes persisted with quiet certainty. Rodents were considered but ruled out. Several of the moved objects were too heavy or arranged with too much precision. Vibrations from passing trucks were tested as a theory, but failed to explain why only this specific room was affected. Even environmental factors like drafts or humidity shifts couldn't account for the patterned arrangements. The most unsettling moment occurred when a roach crate, previously used for swarm scenes, was temporarily stored in the lab for convenience. That night, the movements intensified. Props shifted into curved pathways, almost forming routes across the table, all pointing toward the crate. When the crate was removed from the room the following day, the phenomenon abruptly ceased. The crew never determined whether the incidents were deliberate sabotage, environmental coincidence, or something more abstract, an emergent pattern shaped by the thematic weight of the film itself. Yet many who worked on the set recall a palpable tension in the room, a sense that the environment was quietly reorganizing itself according to a logic no one could interpret. After the film wrapped, the lab set was dismantled, but the decorator kept the continuity photos not as evidence, but as a reminder of the moments when an artificial space seemed to express a will of its own. Fact 18. The slime mixture used throughout The Nest to represent the roach's biological residue became infamous on set for its unpredictable behavior. Designed to mimic the viscous sheen of digestive enzymes, the compound combined glycerin, proprietary thickeners, mineral oils, and tint agents that created a pearlescent shimmer under strong light. Initial batches performed reliably, but once filming began, the substance began demonstrating reactions no one had anticipated. Stored in sealed containers, some batches developed slow, rhythmic bubbling, not random, but patterned, as though something beneath the surface expanded and contracted. Others separated into layers, only to recombine hours later without agitation. A few thickened abruptly, forming ripples that resembled the segmented texture of insect abdomens. During application on set, the slime sometimes moved counter to gravity. In one take, a bead slid upward along a metal cabinet before reversing direction. Actors recoiled, believing they had witnessed an optical illusion, but playback confirmed the movement. The effects team attempted to explain the phenomenon as a result of heat gradients, but similar attempts at reproduction failed. Lighting further intensified the strangeness. Under tungsten sources, the slime emitted faint green undertones, while fog machines caused it to thin and spread into branching trails. These trails formed dendritic patterns reminiscent of burrow networks, shapes that faded when the fog dissipated, leaving no trace on the surface. Perhaps the most unsettling moment occurred when a large batch of slime, left untouched overnight in a mixing tray, hardened into a crust bearing a pattern of interconnected nodes. The design appeared deliberate, almost cellular, though the mixture should not have the capacity to organize itself. Once production ended, every remaining batch degraded into inert paste, losing its unusual characteristics. Attempts to reproduce the original formula yielded stable, predictable mixtures, none capable of the anomalies witnessed on set. To this day, crew members describe the slime as the film's most inexplicable material engineered to resemble organic secretion, yet behaving, however briefly, as though guided by an underlying instinct it was never meant to possess. Fact 19. The motion control system used during the Nest's early visual effects tests was meant to ensure precision, but it soon became one of the most unsettling pieces of equipment on set. The rig's purpose was simple: repeat the same camera move perfectly so miniature elements and practical roach shots could be composited later. During the first few days, the machine performed flawlessly. Then, the deviations began. The arm would stutter for a fraction of a second, pause at odd angles, or drift slightly off its programmed path, always during scenes involving swarm components. Technicians checked every variable: firmware, motor alignment, servo pressure, even the electromagnetic field generated by nearby equipment. Nothing accounted for the disruptions. Stranger still, the abnormalities occurred at moments when the roach models or live insects were in motion. During static shots, the system behaved exactly as designed. At one point, the arm paused mid-movement, lens pointed directly at a cluster of rubber roaches, holding its position as if transfixed. The operators insisted the pause wasn't in the coded trajectory. Playback of that paused moment revealed something even more peculiar: a faint tremor in the swarm props, like a ripple moving through objects that weren't capable of vibration. The tremor was visible in only a handful of frames, yet its timing aligned perfectly with the machine's hesitation. As production continued, the malfunctions escalated. The rig would occasionally restart its path at unpredictable speeds, forcing the crew to abandon several takes. Eventually, the director decided to discontinue the motion control approach altogether, opting for handheld tracking shots instead. Once removed from the set and tested off-site, the system performed flawlessly, repeating every movement with absolute precision. Months later, when a technical team inspected the machine for resale, they found no residue, mechanical strain, or data corruption. It appeared untouched, as if nothing unusual had ever occurred. Yet those who operated it on the Nest remember the same uncanny impression. The rig behaved as though something within the set environment, something tied to the swarm scenes, interrupted its perfect logic and pulled its attention toward the floor. Fact 20. The strangest discovery tied to the Nest surfaced not during production, but years later, when archivists uncovered a bundle of contact sheets buried among unrelated materials. The photographs were unlike any official behind-the-scenes documentation. They depicted recognizable sets, the diner, the cliffside paths, the decaying interiors, but the vantage points were impossibly low, sometimes mere inches above the ground. The framing was deliberate, not accidental, as though whoever took the photos was navigating the space at a crawling height. More troubling was what the photos lacked: people. Even on days when dozens of crew members filled the area, these images captured empty hallways, cleared tabletops, and open doorways. Yet the lighting in each frame matched production logs, proving the shots were taken during active filming hours. No unit photographer recalled capturing them. No notes referenced a secondary stills assignment. When enhanced digitally, several of the images revealed faint, blurred streaks along the edges fast, horizontal motion too low to be human stride. Archivists initially dismissed these as light leaks or dust on the lens, until further inspection revealed consistent segmentation in the streaks, like the blurred outline of something with multiple limbs moving rapidly across the frame. Even the film stock raised questions. The negatives were printed on a type no department had ordered, one discontinued before production began. Serial codes didn't match the studio's inventory. The more archivists investigated, the less the photographs connected to any official workflow. One contact sheet contained a sequence that seemed to trace a path from behind a crate, through a doorway, across a worn floorboard, and toward a narrow crack in the wall. The shots were taken with remarkable steadiness, as if the photographer, whatever its height, moved silently and purposefully. No definitive explanation has ever emerged. The studio classified the photos as unverified material, sealing them to prevent further deterioration. But everyone who has examined them shares the same reaction. These were not the perspectives of a human observer documenting a film set. They resemble the quiet, patient exploration of something moving beneath the level of sight, something observing the production as closely as the cameras observed it. Bonus fact: years after The Nest had finished production and slipped quietly into its cult corner of horror history, a peculiar discovery surfaced during the inventory of an effects warehouse slated for closure. In a dusty metal drawer containing outdated animatronic components, an archivist uncovered a small, unlabeled binder sealed in a plastic sleeve. Inside were sketches, notes, and annotated diagrams that did not correspond to any known department's work. The handwriting was inconsistent, shifting tones and pressure as though multiple people or one person in different states of mind had contributed to the pages. The content was even stranger. Several sketches depicted roach behaviors that eerily mirrored incidents witnessed on set but never publicly documented. Clusters forming spiral structures, vibrations rippling beneath surfaces, and low-angled sightlines resembling the mysterious photographs later discovered in the studio archive. One diagram, drawn in shaking graphite, mapped a pattern identical to the unexplained exposure fluctuations captured by cameras during swarm scenes. Yet the binder was dated weeks before those shots were ever filmed. More cryptic were the written notes. Some pages contained fragmented observations. Movement resumes when unobserved, patterns respond to interruption, avoid direct light reacts adversely, and recording does not capture full activity. One page included a series of numbers arranged like coordinates. When plotted digitally, they traced a looping path that resembled the floor plan of the abandoned coastal building used during production. At the center of the loop sat a small X, labeled simply "Origin Point Unclear." Everyone right everyone. Even more unsettling was a single loose sheet tucked at the back of the binder. It held only one sentence, written with such pressure that the letters had nearly punctured the page. "It changes when we look away." No one from the original crew claimed authorship. Some insisted the binder was an elaborate forgery. Others believed it was an unused concept pitch, abandoned early in development. But the predictions, too aligned with phenomena that occurred months later, resisted easy explanation. The binder now sits sealed in the studio archive, preserved but unread, its origins still disputed. Whether it represents foresight, coincidence, or something far stranger, it remains a rare artifact from a production that seemed, at times, to document events it had not yet experienced. If you've followed these strange traces behind The Nest, you've already stepped into a space where filmmaking and something unspoken briefly overlapped. These stories linger not because they are loud, but because they feel like echoes of a production that refused to stay contained on the screen. If any detail shifted the way you see this film, or if one fact unsettled you more than the rest, share it in the comments. Your perspective shapes the next investigation. And if there's another title whose shadows you want us to dig into, tell us. Which of these hidden moments do you believe, and which ones are you still trying to explain?